Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin.
Back by popular demand, my good friend, Dr. Allan Bacon. You, sir, are one of my most popular guests. People always seem to show up in droves. So if any listeners are themselves podcast hosts, I can't recommend enough. Get Allan on as a guest. But you were on recently. We actually did a big deep dive in supplements, but this time, well, you were interested in talking about plateaus. And there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff here. So let's start. What's actually happening when someone hits a plateau? Is it physiological or psychological or some combination of both?
That is a great question. And this is something that is probably the best thing to start this conversation off with. Training progress is a biological pattern. It follows a loop. It begins with a biological stress that you put on yourself. You have recovery come into play and then adaptation. And that loop goes on. And hopefully, if you're doing progressive overload properly, it leads to more and more adaptation over time. A plateau is the body reaching a temporary equilibrium between the training stress, recovery, and the adaptation. The important thing to understand, and what I want people to really view this as, is it's neither failure nor regression. This is where people really get caught up because they'll view any time that there is a plateau or a stall of any time period as, oh my God, I'm failing. I need to change something up. Nothing's working. It's a checkpoint between progress phases. And when we start to realize that we can get a little bit more comfortable with being patient, trusting the process, we can systemically analyze the training modalities that we have in place, if there's anything wrong with that, and then adjust accordingly without having to freak out and think, okay, anytime that I face any sort of plateau, it's a problem, because it really isn't. And if people start to look at this as a non-scale victory, they can start to be more successful long term. Because if you've hit a new PR, whether it is a new lower body weight, whether it's a better bench press, whatever it is, slower circumference measurements around body parts, this is one of those non-scale victories that we talk about where, you didn't regress. And in the past, maybe you would have looked at this as a failure, but in reality, it's a big win.
There's something here I really, really want to double down on.
Sure.
It is evidence that you've been able to sustain whether fat loss, muscle gain, strength, because those are really the three kind of big ones. It is evidence that you've been able to now sustain a new, in this context, time window, a best ever. It is, as you said, it's a non-scale victory.
Well, it's a different you, and so maintaining, I think that people really undervalue the maintenance of this type of stuff. And I mean, how many times have you had a client and you're like, okay, well, we're going into a maintenance phase for whatever reason. Life is becoming really busy and maybe we cannot focus on going balls to the wall to progress as much as possible, but we want to be able to maintain. Anytime we fall into these maintenance type phases, and this is irrespective of whether we're considering it a plateau, it seems to be the toughest part for trainees and clients to get through because they view this as I'm not doing anything. When in reality, you're doing a lot. You're doing something different than what you've ever done before, and that's a big thing to be conscious of. Now, whether a plateau is physiological or purely psychological, it doesn't seem to be one or the other, at least in most cases. It's rarely purely physiological or rarely purely psychological. It seems to be that each side feeds the other. As an example, a client can lose motivation, which is a psychological beginning, and that can lead to lowered exercise intensity, which could lead to no progressive overload, which is the physiologic manifestation of that. You could do it in the reverse. I mean, maybe you were training hard without enough recovery. That's physiological fatigue building up, leads to burnout and apathy, which is a psychological aspect or a psychological ramification of that. So they tend to come in pairs. And so being conscious of the fact that it can come in either direction is really important. And being conscious of the underlying beliefs that we use, because this is one of those things that I believe that you wanted to touch on as well. Underlying beliefs that we have about this can be sabotaging. And it's often the hidden driver behind most of these plateaus. Because even when a person thinks, that they're training harder, they're eating better, the stall usually traces back to deep-seated beliefs that we use to sabotage our own consistency and patience.
Mm.
And that's what it's really about. The consistency and patience typically are the biggest issues. And there are a variety of beliefs that we use to cause these issues. I mean, you've probably seen one of the most common things that we see in our clients is the all or nothing mentality. And life is rarely all or nothing. So switching that over to all or something becomes a very beneficial thing, because when people view this as an all or nothing thing, the second they can't be 100%, everything goes out the window. All that habit formation process, the systems that we have in place, all of those things that we were looking to instill in ourselves to be able to maintain this long term seem to be forgotten, because, hey, if I can't be perfect, may as well not be anything. And
I
that's a
think
really big stumbling block.
A quick break from this episode to shout out RP Strength and the RP Hypertrophy app. I have a big confession. I've never used a coach before. I've always auto-regulated my training for decades. But I've known Dr. Mike Isertel and Nick Shaw, the founders of RP, for years, and I'll get behind anything they create, including years of reading their books, consuming their media, attending their seminars, and having them as guests on the show. And I've been using the RP Hypertrophy app now for several months. And several things have happened. It forced me to make smaller and more gradual but better increases in weight volume across time, like putting 5-pound plates on each side of a leg press. Like, who does that? Never before. Only 45s. It cut out the junk volume. It made my workouts faster and more efficient. I show up with a plan. I didn't have to think about what to do. I feel more accountable having a log my progress. And I don't skip things because I don't feel like it. If hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to manage your gains and to take the guesswork out of your program. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free, and if you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. And I've also got you a $50 US dollar discount, so go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes. That's rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP.
I think there's something even more insidious going on here. And because the time of this release will be, we're coming up on New Year's. And I think New Year's is the ultimate illustration. And forgive me if listeners have heard me say this before on other places of the podcast. I think a lot of this is wrapped up in identity. And I think that people will look for soothing, emotionally soothing narratives, stories to tell themselves. And one of those stories is they're looking for evidence, or that they are not the kind of person who do the thing, or they're averse to evidence that they are that type of person. And I think New Year's is a common illustration where people jump in without the skill or support. They decide that they're going to do something relatively extreme, certainly unsustainable, like working out 5 to 6 days a week, going to the gym. They don't even know how to set this sort of thing up. Overly restrict with their nutrition, right? I'm never going to have sugar again. I'm never going to have alcohol again. Those may work in rare cases, but usually probably have to graduate those approaches.
Yeah.
And after, 3, 6, maybe 8 weeks of white knuckling it, and they plateau, or they like, I can't continue to do this. And then because their idea of healthy lifestyle is in that extreme approach, that all position that's not sustainable, then it's evidence to see, I'm not the kind of person who can do this, because something has been screaming either in the back of their mind or very forefront. And that voice gets louder as people gain body weight. They see other people around them struggling from the ill effects of metabolic unhealth. They themselves are maybe getting red flags about their metabolic unhealth. And they're worried. And so that screams at them. And New Year's obviously is the emotional time to do something about it. But I actually believe that there's a cohort, a subsection of that population that, part of it's not knowing what to do, but I think sometimes there's something insidious that proactively sabotages people, where they set themselves up to fail.
It's called the I don't deserve it belief. And you're 100% spot on. All or nothing mentality, the I don't deserve it belief, they tend to go hand in hand. Quite often, because like you said, what people do is they try to white knuckle it or raw dog it, for lack of a better term. And people you can do anything for 8, 12 weeks, but that doesn't mean it's sustainable. And this is one of the reasons that people really reach out to things like, massive fad diets, because it seems extreme, and maybe something more extreme would be beneficial for them. And then, they hit their first road bump and they're like, okay, well, I don't deserve it. Or they set the road bumps in front of themselves. And this is where that self-sabotage really comes into play. And, there's a variety of different beliefs. And I think that the one that you've touched on here is very relevant, particularly around these holiday seasons, because let's say that a person has been very, very strict leading up into these holidays. They almost don't give themselves the grace or the permission to ever deviate from this really strict set of rules that they've set for themselves. And that becomes something that's very difficult to sustain long term. But their entire belief structure is set up around, well, if I'm not all in, then again, you're switching into that I don't deserve it belief mentality. And so what you've touched on here is very true because they tend to come in tandem.
And I really do think that a key aspect of this is to calm the emotional discomfort of knowing that you're doing something wrong or not feeling good about it. And if you can create evidence, proof in your mind that you're just not the kind of person to do it, it calms down, but only for a while until someone continues to gain a little more weight, feel a little bit worse, energy's worse, they just feel less healthy. Their self-confidence starts screaming at them again. And then the cycle builds up again. And I actually think there's a partial explanation for the New Year's resolution annual cycle for a certain subsection of population. Something you said, I want you to go into this too, is the I believe people have this expectation that when they're dieting, that it's a permanent state of being. And I like to
Mhm.
think in terms of seasons, in cycles, macro cycles even. So do you want to speak to that?
Well, so dieting, the thing when we're looking at dieting is whether we're not in a calorie deficit is typically what we think of with dieting.
Mm,
The problem that we have with this being a lifestyle change, which is what we're intending to move towards, is that we view food as either we're eating, it's that dichotomy, right? We're either eating healthy foods or we're eating not healthy foods.
mm,
And when we're on that diet, we're only allowed to eat those healthy foods. And so when we talk about seasons, you can incorporate, and we often talk about this, incorporating, traditionally indulgent foods within the dieting phases within a controlled manner. When you get outside of these dieting phases, this is where that dichotomy really is problematic. Now, there are different seasons like you're suggesting. And when there are different seasons, whether we're trying to actively lose body fat or we're trying to move into more of a maintenance phase or maybe building lean muscle, the ratio of these more indulgent foods can go up slightly. But that doesn't mean that at any point in life do we move away from that base of whole minimally processed foods. And I think that this is where that issue comes into play with a lot of people is they view, okay, well, I'm going to start eating, lean chicken breasts, other lean meats. I'm going to start eating my fruits and veggies. And that is only relevant to my diet phase.
mm.
And this is the problem that a lot of people get stuck in. Even when there are changes of season, yes, you're going to eat more fruits and veggies potentially as ways to increase satiety, lower calorie intakes. Um, you're not going to give those up though in a different season. And this is where people get caught up because they view it as, okay, well, the second that I'm no longer in this diet, the second that I'm no longer trying to lose body fat, I can just immediately switch back to eat whatever I want. So there are seasons, yes, but it typically comes with you're eating larger amounts of those same foods that you would be eating on the traditional diet periods. And I think
So
that that's where people get caught up a lot because they believe that they're only eating those certain types of foods during that period and then never again.
Mm. So I guess in its extreme form, seasons is just a more socially acceptable way to think about pure on and off behavior if you frame it
Sure.
wrong.
Sure,
What
if you
about,
frame it wrong, if you look at it wrong, and I think that's the problem that most people get into is because they view, and not you, but when we talk
mm,
about our clients, they view dieting as a very distinctly different
mm.
thing than normal eating. And it's not. It's a shift to a different type of normal eating because you're starting to learn to eat for the person that you want to become. So, are you going to be eating those types of foods? Largely, yes, for extended periods of time. You're going to be cooking for yourself. You're going to be conscious of, am I getting enough protein? Maybe you're not measuring 24/7 or in every season, but you're still going to take those things into account. So yes, the seasons change, but that lifestyle shift has to happen if this is going to be a long-term sustainable thing.
So how do you approach working with clients, tactics even, through fat loss plateaus?
Fat loss plateaus, first, there are four big culprits that I want to evaluate first before we say that we're in a fat loss plateau. Because just like any other kind of plateau, we kind of jump with the gun and immediately say, okay, well, I haven't lost any body fat in 2 weeks. We're up and the scale's not dropped in 2 weeks. I'm in a plateau.
Mm.
Maybe, maybe not. Um, we want to first make sure that there is the potential for the plateau. So if we're not tracking, well, you can't say that you're in a plateau because you don't really know what you're eating. So if we are tracking, do we have an inaccurate calorie intake for some reason? And people hate hearing this because it's almost like an affront to their competency, and people hate feeling incompetent about anything. But why would you automatically know how to track calories, track food perfectly? There's a lot of nuance to it that I think that people don't really understand because there's so many people online that say, hey, just hop onto YouTube and learn how to do it, and you can do it in a weekend and everything is fine. I can tell you that, I see hundreds of clients every year, and very few of them know how to track calories accurately, even with the ones that have done macros for years. And we see in research, calorie tracking inaccuracies are about 500 calories per day per person. They think that they're taking in 500 calories less than what they actually are. And in the case of obesity, it can be up to about 1,100 calories. And that's probably one of the reasons why obesity is in play, because we're really underestimating the amount of food that we're eating in a lot of cases. I mean, even when we look at registered dietitians are off by about 200 calories per day. So if a registered dietitian, a person that went to school for years to learn this type of stuff, has significant inaccuracies, why would you expect yourself to be perfect? So check your records, check your logs. If you don't really understand how to do that, get a coach, have them review these types of things, figure out if you have any holes in your practices, because oftentimes this is the issue right there. You've just got inaccurate tracking. And so what you think is a plateau is just you pulling in about 500 extra calories per day, which can very easily pull people into accidental maintenance. So there's an issue right there. Maybe you're overestimating activity levels. If you're using one of those watches or Aura rings or something like that to tell you your calories burned, they can be off by up to 92%.
Mm.
So there's a big issue right there. I never recommend that people, when they're actively tracking their intakes, that they subtract any of the calories burned because it's
Mm.
so inaccurate. And typically, you don't really have to track that type of thing once you've established your maintenance calories by monitoring your progress over some time, because your activity levels don't dramatically vary in most cases, person to person. It's not like one week you're running a marathon, the next week you're not. The next week you're running a marathon, the next week you're not. That just doesn't really happen. So having to track um, activity once you've established where your maintenance levels are, you don't really have to do that. Monitoring rates of progress is far more valuable than anything else. And any adjustments that you make to your intake will massage out any of the errors and any kind of overestimation of where you were with activity levels, as long as you're not subtracting those out. And then people could be confusing weight loss and fat loss. You could very easily be losing body fat and the weight could not be changing. Maybe there's water flux in play. Maybe you're a woman at a certain part of your cycle and hormones are affecting you and you're holding water. Maybe you've had a significant amount of sodium during a certain time period, and then maybe for 48 hours you're going to be holding water. Now, if we're looking at long enough periods of time, you're going to be able to tell trends, and that's what's most important. But if we're only looking at 1 or 2 week time frames, I mean, people will jump on that bandwagon to say, okay, well, I'm in a plateau, and not giving themselves enough time between measurements to even understand if they are in a plateau or if they're just experiencing water flux. And water flux can be so dramatic. I mean, we could see 5 or even 10-pound shifts. Now, 10-pound shifts are a little bit more rare, but 5-pound shifts are not extremely rare. Um, and so what we want to do is we want to have a little bit of stability there. Be conscious of changes in the foods that you're eating on a daily basis. If you have a set meals that you typically eat, if all of a sudden you have a significant amount of extra calories, significant amount of extra carbs, significant amount of extra sodium, maybe that's affecting you for 48 or 72 hours or a certain time period afterwards. But what you want to do is you want to be able to remove as much of this error as possible. And so what I recommend to people is having some stability for when you take your measurements, whether it's your scale measurements or your circumference measurements. Measure, weigh, first thing upon waking, after going to the bathroom, before eating or drinking. It removes as much food weight, water flux, any other kind of influence on that as we can. Because if we are doing this and we're not really paying attention to when we're weighing, I mean, maybe you had extra food in your system that could add 2 or 3 pounds very easily. Maybe you've had that extra sodium in the beginning of the day. You're going to weigh more at the end of the day than you are in the beginning of the day, just because of the natural variance in water and muscle glycogen, all those other things. So by having some stability there, you can figure that out. And then, of course, are there any health issues in play? Um, it's rare that a health issue or medical issue would be the problem, but certain issues with autoimmune diseases, cardiometabolic disorders could cause some issues with culprits that you may not be paying attention to. But assuming you've checked out the other ones, um, you can get a little bit of a baseline to be able to identify whether it's a medical problem in play, in which case you should be seeing a doctor, or if it's something that is a hole in the practices that you have.
I feel like
A
there
lot
was
of
a
stuff,
period of, yeah,
a lot of stuff thrown at you right there.
something you threw there. It's worth touching on. I feel like, I don't know, maybe it was like 4 to 8 plus years ago, we would routinely see pushback from people against the calories in, calories out. And then they would say, oh,
hmm
there's some sort of health thing going on. But I think we now know the medical research on this, that the disorders that have that kind of influence are actually exceedingly rare. And this is more
Yeah.
or less an ideological narrative to deflect from the fact that no, it is. I mean, we know it's not remotely as simple as just calories in, calories out, but it absolutely underpins the thermodynamics of this, underpins everything else.
hmm And I think that there two things can't exist. And I want this to be understood because people think that when you say, or when anybody says, calories in, calories out are what matter. And then the argument always comes into play, well, what if the body does this? Or what if you choose different types of food? Because, 1,000 calories of sugar is not the same as 1,000 calories of
Mm.
chicken breast. Yes, that's 100% true. But that's not exactly what calories in, calories out is saying. Calories in, calories out is what it is saying is it's energy balance, and it's looking at the energy in a system, and all it is claiming is differences and changes over time in weight loss or weight gain. The foods that you eat matter. There's going to be different thermic effects of food. There's going
Mm.
to be different metabolic processes I mean, protein is very metabolically thrifty, or sorry, metabolically expensive. Protein is very
Mm.
metabolically expensive to the fact where people are like, well, if I eat a bunch of protein, I can add in more calories from protein and I don't gain a lot of body fat. Yes, because that calories outside of the equation massively goes up because it's a lot harder to process protein than it is to process dietary fat.
Mm.
But that doesn't invalidate calories in, calories out. And so we got into these arguments a couple of years ago, I think because people were only looking at that calories inside and not really identifying that calories outside. Now, even beyond all that, energy balance is only saying it is telling the changes in weight over time. Certain things like water weight shifts can cause variance within that, but
Mm.
that has nothing to do with, accruing more body fat, or even losing more body fat. That's just shifts in something else that's not part of energy balance.
How much of the fat loss plateau is psychological in that it's diet fatigue?
Um, I think a lot, and I think a lot of it is probably diet fatigue because I think that um, people view people usually, like you said in the beginning, people will usually go from doing absolutely nothing to trying to throw in a whole bunch of stuff at once. I'm going to completely revamp my diet. I'm going to change up and completely start working out 6 times a week. I've never worked out before. I'm going to start tracking all of my foods and even doing like 60% adherence to a diet when you've added in all these different things can feel very fatiguing because it's a massive change in your life. And I'm not saying that some people can't do that. But what I'm saying is diet fatigue can be viewed differently by different people. And when you're majorly changing up a lot of different pieces in your life, it can feel more fatiguing because you're adding in so many different things that require concerted mental effort instead of attempting to go in piecemeal and saying, okay, well, I'm going to start with just walking a little bit more this day and maybe trying to get some more fruits and veggies in my diet, not necessarily tracking. And you can start to build up that way and make those habits a little bit easier, put them on autopilot. So, this whole idea of diet fatigue can hit you from a couple angles. It takes a lot of effort to actively maintain a diet. And then the longer you do it, the more that you look it as a restriction, the more that that restrictive mindset starts to add on that fatigue as well. So diet fatigue comes from a bunch of different angles, but how much of the plateau is that? It can be a significant amount because the more that you feel fatigued, the less consistent and adherent you might actually be to the plan that you have set out. So if you are tracking things and you have a calorie allotment that you're supposed to be hitting, that can start to dip over time. Motivation can take a hit, consistency can take a hit, and your patience can take a hit. So all of that tends to add up.
You mentioned, and I really want to hit on this, perception of restriction. So going back to what you said about people can be off by 500 calories. So in
Mhm.
theory, we're dealing with humans here, right? In isolation, let's say someone were consistently over consuming by 500 calories. And let's say we had set a target, I'll use the perfect example here, of 1,700 calories for a
I,
moderately
I knew
active,
exactly where you were going to go with this.
smaller woman, right? So
Hmm.
let's say target 1,700, but in practice,
Hmm.
we could probably guess she's getting 2,200 calories. So, and I
Sure.
know the problem with this, but I definitely want to frame it. So let's say we say, well, we know that she's consistently over consuming by 500. So then let's just set the goal at, the mythical 1,200 calorie number, which
Yep.
we suspect she'll probably get around the 17. Now, on top of the coaches screaming bloody murder at the mere suggestion of 1,200 calories, and I think in virtually all cases, that's probably less than almost everybody needs outside of very small and very sedentary women. Yes, there are actually, sorry guys, there are very, very narrow cases where that's actually maintenance calories for some people. In a perfect world, I want that tiny woman, to move around a whole bunch more. I want her working out whatever to where
Yep.
1,200 is no longer her maintenance. But there are people who in our society need 1,200 calories. It is a
Mhm.
thing. It's rare. Okay. Anyway, take that and run with it.
Well, okay. I was just trying to figure out what the exact question was there. See, here's the thing.
Well, does that
Would it
work? Because we have, again, how powerful is the perception of restriction in fighting against this?
incredibly powerful. I mean, this is that type of situation where you feel like you're doing everything perfectly and nothing is working, therefore you're different or your body's broken. That's what this ultimately ends up leading at. Now, when we understand that um, for women, the average resting metabolic rate, even for women that weight train, is about 1,465 calories, give or take. Believe it or not, it's that low. Now, that does not add in non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, all that movement that we do throughout the day, all of our activity. It doesn't add in the activity that we do at the gym. And so when you're talking about 1,200 is probably way too low for maintenance. Yeah, I mean, you're probably 300 calories above that just by existing. You're probably 300 calories above that as an average sized woman. Um, but conceivably, you could be down at 1,200 calories if your maintenance level is 1,700 and, predictable movement for fat loss is between 250 and 500 calories below maintenance. You could conceivably be at about 1,200 calories necessary to move, but you could be viewing yourself as 1,700 calories if you've got that average error in play. So you might think you're eating 1,700 calories and then you're not even moving. Now, your first reaction of, well, if you're that low, because this is going to be a person that is relatively sedentary, like you pointed out, the first thing that you should be doing is moving, and that's a really important thing. But the perception of where we are, how hard we're trying, and then the lack of results in a lot of cases can be very, very damaging because um, it makes it feel hopeless. And I think that this is where a lot of people get thrown off long term because they want to put the effort in, and it feels really hard. I mean, it's the whole process when you get the right plan down is relatively simple. And I think that a lot of people can even ask themselves, what would a healthy person do in my situation, and be in the rough ballpark of what they should be doing. There's a difference between it being simple and it being easy. And this is the area where it becomes really hard because when we have those expectations in play, and maybe even when we have that accurate counting error as a problem, it feels like we're trying much harder than where we may actually be from a math perspective. So I think that your idea of um, is this something that's really going to throw people off? Yeah, absolutely. Because that mental aspect and how you view this can feel very restrictive, especially if you think that you're extra low on calories. And like you said, the magic number is always 1200 for whatever reason. But there are so many people that say, hey, I was down at 1200 calories and I wasn't moving. And so then I switched to something like keto, and all of a sudden I was moving at higher calories. Well, what probably ended up happening was you were more accurate in your counting because you removed a food group that maybe you were inaccurately counting.
Mm.
And so these things can cause some false senses of what really works. It can cause people to switch to severe or very restrictive diets. And that can feel great in the short term, particularly with things like keto, where you get that initial bump down from loss of muscle glycogen, loss of water. So the scale weight drops precipitously, at least in the first 4 to 6 weeks before it normalizes. But this is why people get onto those fad diets and why they struggle so much long term, because once that water flux goes out, once the appeal or um, the mystique of these fad diets wear off, well, that tracking error may partially still be in play. You may start to see that yourself is as very restricted from that sense, and then it compounds on itself.
There's important concept baked in here I would love to get you to touch on. How daily calorie needs are actually a moving target based on loss of weight, gain of weight.
hmm they are, and people should really understand that daily maintenance needs are a range anyways. And they're a range because you're going to eat slightly different variations of food, so there's going to be different thermic effects of food. You're going to have different activity levels throughout a day. Your body has some variance, from time to time. So there's going to be shifts in the way that the body processes these calories. So there's definitely going to be um, some variance in the way that these things work on a daily basis. And so if you're setting up a plan to attempt to lose some body fat, I always recommend people use um, ranges rather than a distinct number. So you can feel better about yourself, one, but you can adjust with shifts in the way that your body metabolizes things and those shifts in the daily activity levels. But if you're saying, hey, my goal to be in fat loss is 1500 calories, well, give yourself a break. Hitting between 1450 and 1550 is probably a
Mm.
good range, and that will help you to get through um, all the things that life throws at you along this journey, because trying to stick to an exact number can both feel restrictive and defeating in a lot of sense when maybe the scale doesn't move in the way that you thought it would because of these variances. So looking at this over a longer period of time
Mm.
and giving yourself the grace to have the ability to hit a wider range within a certain boundary. And so I always tell people with a 100-calorie boundary, 50 calories on either side, um, it allows people to calm down a little bit and likely see higher levels of success long term.
I do something similar in that I tend to talk to all my clients about thinking about your calorie needs across at least a week. You alluded to larger timescales, so
hmm
I may still have a more specific target, but knowing that there's variance and talk them through it, that if they're a bit over on one day, well, then they can be a bit under on another day or vice versa. So that way across a week and onward, that it averages pretty close to the target. So that's something I
In
like doing.
in most cases, that's a great way to do it.
Mhm.
The one thing that I would caution people on, because you can certainly do that. You can look at a week's time frame and say, hey, how am I doing on if I'm shooting for like 1500 calorie average, maybe one day you get 1800, maybe one day you get less, and it averages out to 1,500 over the week, that's going to work out perfectly fine. The one thing that I would be cautious of, and I've only seen this a few times with working with clients, they'll say, okay, cool. So if the weekly averages are all that matter, I'm going to basically starve myself all week and then binge on the weekends. One, that can promote disordered eating, but two, that could work for fat loss or weight loss. But remember, we're trying to lose the body fat, retain or build some lean muscle. For most people, I mean, that's going to be beneficial, and maintain our health. If we have dramatically varying days in these examples, Monday I'm getting 600 calories, Tuesday I'm getting 800 calories, Saturday I'm getting 3,500 calories. Those days that you're really low, you're probably, micronutrient deficient. You're probably low on protein. Maybe you are, strangely enough, I've actually seen this quite a bit. Maybe you are massively undershooting dietary fat intake. And I see that with women a lot. And then, this could be one of those causes of amenorrhea. So this variance and looking at it as a week-long thing is very valid. I would caution people, if you're going to look at it in that manner, make it so the changes between the lower days and the higher days, especially if you're planning this intentionally. And I brought this up because I see people do, okay, during the work week, I'm going to have this many calories, and then the weekend, I'm going to have this many calories. And it works. And I've done it for people. But I keep that variance within a couple hundred calories.
Agreed.
To allow them, to give them the freedom to have some more food on the weekends, which we typically are going to be indulging a little bit more, which is fine. But it also assures that we're not going into nutrient deficiencies during the week and having those really high ups and downs, and maybe promoting binge and restrict type cycles. So the week long process works very, very well. But this is almost like a conversation, kind of akin to that whole energy balance thing, where like the energy balance matters, but then some of these other things matter as well. If we're looking for maximal health, maximal performance, best body composition, all these other things factor in. And then on top of that, we have the emotional aspect that comes with this.
And to double down on your point, absolutely have to be on guard against any inclination towards doing anything extreme, extreme restriction on some days in order to be able to justify a framework that, socially acceptable binging and disordered eating behavior. So yeah, so absolutely got to be baked in. How much can exercise actually increase calorie output?
Not as much as people think or hope. I think it's hope more than anything else.
Mm.
And it's going to be dependent on how heavy are you, how much muscle do you have, what activity are you engaging in? I mean, resistance training, and this is the funny thing. People think if I'm doing really intense lifting, like heavy lifting, I'm maxing out, I'm going to burn so many calories. Probably not. You're probably not burning that many calories. In fact, more reps probably burn slightly more calories. I mean, it's really not that significant in a difference, but you're not really burning more by really grinding out these heavy maxes. For resistance training for an average person, you're going to burn maybe on average 250 calories, even in a hard session. And I'm assuming that we're not talking about something like a CrossFit Hero WOD that's an hour long, no rest at all. We're talking about, a standard powerlifter, bodybuilder, physique style routine. You're probably burning about 250 calories, maybe less if you're smaller, maybe more if you're a little bit bigger. Aerobic exercise, you're burning for a decent sized session. And I'm not talking about higher intensity interval training. I'm talking more about like moderate runs, because volume tends to be more influential than anything else. It's about 400 calories in a session. If we're doing ultra endurance work, about 900 calories, but very few people are going to be doing these ultra endurance work situations. And so, when we talk about exercise, it just, you don't lift weights and you don't do standard cardio like high intensity interval training or these 30 to 45-minute moderate sessions, which is what's typical for most people. You don't really do those to lose fat. They're a great adjunct. They're not going to hurt. They're going to burn some calories. You can get like maybe a Snickers bar out of it. But that's not typically what's going to be the biggest needle mover anyways. The biggest needle mover is going to be one, nutrition, because you can control that most easily. And then, your standard daily activity levels. And you and I have talked about this a whole bunch, that non-exercise activity thermogenesis. all the movement that you do throughout the day, everything that you do at work, your steps. And that's why we, as coaches, often have our clients follow a step count. The steps act as a proxy for NEAT because obviously we can't really understand, if you talk with your hands a whole lot, if you fidget a whole lot, but we can see step count. And that's a way for us to say, hey, look, you've got a situation where you're being extra sedentary, and I usually will see my clients who are at 3 or 4,000 steps daily. And this is a little bit of an anecdote, so don't take this as a scientific proof. But when I see my clients at 3 or 4,000 steps, I'm like, hey, you're very sedentary. Let's see if we can get this up to about 6 to 8, and then go from there. And I would prefer, as a coach, I would prefer that we get steps up prior to saying, hey, let's immediately start to remove a lot of food from the diet. Obviously, if body fat loss is a goal, you're going to control calorie intake, but I would rather give people as much food as possible and control more fat loss through high energy flux situations like being able to move a lot more.
And to extrapolate that even further, what we often observe is, especially if people are doing some fairly high intensity attempts at exercise, then you probably offset that extra calorie burn by increased hunger later or being tired and actually being more sedentary and less neat later in the day. So it's not an argument not to do it, right? I think,
Mm-hmm.
as you alluded to, I tend to look at cardio as there are three reasons. The main one is cardiovascular health. Okay, that's the big one
Yep.
for everybody. You should be doing it. Two is you may have specific cardiovascular demands, whether anaerobic, aerobic, energy system stuff, to be able to do activities you enjoy. You want to have stamina for that. And then a very distant third is the caloric output side of things. But again, I don't like wielding this argument because I think, I'm going to go on a bit of a diatribe here because you'll get the pedantic evidence-based types, and they will say on their social media that, uh, you know, exercise doesn't burn as many calories as you think. Okay, cool, right, gotcha, right. But they
This is not an excuse not to do cardio.
yeah, they weaponize it, and then they'll say all the things we're kind of saying, but in a more absolute, explicit sort of way. And there are, I don't know, God, 6, 7, 8 of these different things that people, the increased amount of calories that you actually burn post-workout as recovery, the increased amount of calories that you burn because you have a few more pounds of muscle mass. Here's the thing. When you add all of these things up together, that may be 2, 3, 400 calories across a day. And I'm talking about all these things that people will individually pick apart and neutralize. And guess what? 300 to 400 calories a day in someone's activity level is massive, especially if we're talking about a smaller woman.
That makes a
So
huge difference.
huge
And
difference, right?
there's actually one thing that I wanted to touch on that you brought up that is a really good thing to know, because if we're talking about the benefits of cardio and we want to really understand what's going on, one of the things that you had said, and this isn't just cardio, this is exercise in general. Cardio seems to do it pretty significantly, but it does happen with lifting as well. You talked about compensation
Mm,
for the calorie burn through things like increased hunger
mm,
and movement compensation. There is compensation. Lifting sessions, it's between 20 and 40% of the calories that you burn. You will typically have hunger to eat back. With aerobic work, it's 30 to 70%. But the thing is, that's initially. And this is where I think a lot of the times people that really downplay cardio kind of miss out a little bit. And I think that this can strengthen your argument. Initially, you get a lot more hungry. Exercise, cardio in particular, weightlifting does it too, but they're both really good for weight management long term. It preserves the
mm.
lean muscle mass like you were talking about, so it's going to keep that, resting metabolic rate up. You're going to burn more fat when your muscles are actually moving by having more muscle, and it maintains metabolic rate, but it actually improves appetite control over time. And I think that that's what people don't really understand. Yes, appetite temporarily is increased when you're getting into lifting and exercise for the first time, but it improves appetite regulation when done chronically. Leptin and insulin sensitivity improve. Um, GLP-1 and PYY rise more effectively post-meal. So there's a lot of benefits to doing cardio beyond the it's going to burn a whole lot of calories right now. And so I don't want people to misconstrue my comment earlier of
Mm.
it doesn't burn a whole lot of calories, for it doesn't have value for both fat loss, satiety, and keeping that fat off long term because it has very real value for that. And I think that this is where a lot of people are missing out. On top of the fact that if you want to talk about benefits to cardio beyond what you were talking about, I mean, one of the things, and this is how I try to sell it to men, it aids in lean muscle building.
Mm.
It improves capillary density, which transports growth factors and nutrients to the muscle and has been shown in research to be able to increase lean muscle building.
You just summarize a point. It's why some people consider cardio and exercise output to be poor drivers of fat loss, but good for weight management. And I'm comfortable
Mhm.
with that statement. I think it's great to look at it through that lens. And you said it yourself, nutrition is still the most potent driver for fat loss.
So this is why people, when you're thinking about this, using cardio as a punishment for something that you've eaten is probably a really stupid idea. And you're not stupid for thinking that because it feels really hard. So if I'm working really hard, I got to be burning a lot of calories. No, you're not. It's a really bad idea as a punishment for something that you've done, but it's a really good idea as a standard part of your life for all the benefits that we just talked about.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and the service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps eating out that cost way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me Meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes. So I mentioned earlier, but I would love for you to quantify it. How many extra daily calories do we burn gaining muscle mass, roughly per pound of muscle mass?
We burn about 10 extra calories per day. It varies. It's between like 9 and 14 or 15, depending on the study that you look at. Now what people will say if there are people that are really versed in the research, they'll look at what I've just said and they're like, well, I saw a study that said RMR increases 6 to 8 calories per pound of muscle. You're actually going to burn about 10. And you're burning about 10 because yes, RMR does increase about 6 to 8, but your body with more lean muscle mass, it's more metabolically active tissue even while you're performing activities. So it's going to become a net. You're burning about 10 for every pound of muscle that you build. Now that doesn't seem like a whole lot, but when we talk about, how much muscle can a person put on,
Mm.
men over 5+ years of lifting, let's assume that we're doing everything optimally during these 5 years and we're not in like massive calorie deficits, which are going to impede muscle building. We're not elderly where there's anabolic signaling challenges. Men over 5+ years can build 20 to 40 pounds of muscle, dry lean mass. Women can build 10 to 20 pounds. So that's 400 extra calories just sitting there doing nothing per day.
And and compound that with, and this is kind of one of my points to people, the activity to do that is extra calorie output, even net
Right.
of the adaptation you mentioned earlier. And the God, okay, brain is stumbling here. The post-exercise extra calorie burn, the recovery.
Excess post
Yep,
excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC.
right. Exactly, right. And then the extra calorie burn that also goes into the let's call it repair and growth of, new muscle as well. So all of these things, and my underlying point is, when you add them all together, I really do think that, and this is what we're trying to get people to do. It's nothing extreme. It's a reasonable amount of resistance training a week. It's, a solid amount of cardio a week. Maybe it's 2 hours of resistance training. Maybe it's, 150 minutes, of cardio. And you add that all together. And I really do think it's actually collectively a pretty big difference in daily calorie average demands.
It is. It's significant. And these are the types of things that as a coach, we hammer this into people because if we can start building on this, I mean, remember in the beginning, we talked about trying to change all of these things at once is really, really difficult because it requires so much effort
Mm.
when you don't have this as an automatic thing. I mean, over time, as you lift more, as you do more cardio, you start to view it as your identity. You start to enjoy some of these things. Hopefully, you start to enjoy some of these things. It starts to become your regular routine. So it requires less willpower throughout. The more of these things that you put on autopilot, the more that watch your step count and stay active. I mean, even if you have somebody watch their step count for like 3 or 6 months, it's not the fact that we're having you monitor it that's the really important thing. It's that while you're monitoring it, you're learning to start to do some more movement throughout the day. And if you do that day after day after day, and it doesn't feel like such a burden anymore, then a lot of these things go on autopilot. And then by the time you're leaner, you automatically do three-fourths of these things. And coaches always talk about, oh, well, if a person doesn't lose body fat, I mean, this is in the past, we'd always said, oh, if a person doesn't lose body fat, it's a willpower issue. It's willpower is certainly part of it.
Mm.
The pendulum has swung the other way, and coaches are like, "Oh, it's not willpower at all. It's a really complex thing." It's a complex thing, but willpower is a part of it. The issue with willpower is the people that are ultimately successful test their willpower less on a daily basis than the people that struggle all the time. So it's not that willpower isn't a part. You are trying to raw dog it by not setting up, the proper food environments, by not learning to lift regularly and start to make it part of your identity or just as something that you do. You're not bringing in activity levels. You're not switching to the lean minimally processed meat, poultry, fish, fruits and veggies. Like all of these things compound into what you're exactly talking about here. You're laying piece by piece by piece by piece and setting that foundation to ultimately test your willpower less and less and less in the future. And so, both recognizing that calorie burn from these activities individually are probably not the best use of time to punish yourself with, but also acknowledging the fact that added up with some of these other things can make a really big difference long term. They can coexist. And the ultimate end game there is the fact that you have to test your willpower less often. You become somebody that views yourself as this is what you do. You actually start to have fun with it. And this goes on a long-term success spree instead of fighting with it every year.
And what you're saying is, when we build these behaviors into our identity, they become our default setting, and then we bypass the need to lean on willpower. Now, it's kind of funny. We, for a long time, we thought about things functionally as willpower fatigue, that your willpower fatigues. Now, I think the evidence-based side of it, technically speaking, kind of debunked that, there is, you know, a barometer of willpower that ultimately fatigues. But I still think it more or less works that way in practice. So what you described is just simply engineering so many of these things so that way they don't actually, let's call it deplete your willpower. Because I found that that's how it feels in practice, even if
Mhm.
it's not, maybe there's some scientific backing for it.
I mean, and it may be semantics in the way that we term this
Mm.
because a lot of this is what ends up feeding into that diet fatigue that you were talking about earlier. I mean, you know, you're putting in all the effort to do all these different things, but you're having to force so many of them, and that fatigue builds more and more and more. So figuring out ways that you can start to put these things on autopilot really matter, and that the way that you talk to yourself about these things really matter, because that restrictive mindset is never going to work in the same way that an abundance mindset or core value eating works. When you're always viewing yourself as, oh, I can't eat that, or I can't eat that, or, that type of food is off limits for me. Unless it's a trigger food, I probably wouldn't look at it that way. But if it's a trigger food for you, you can identify that and say, okay, I probably will do better without having that food in my life, at least for a certain amount of time until I feel more control over that situation. But the abundance mindset tends to work the best for the longest period of time because you start to view it as, okay, well, what can I add to my daily nutrition or my daily activity levels to improve my life? What can I do to wake myself up to feel a little bit better? Can I add some fruits and veggies to my diet, which secondarily are going to start to push out some other foods because they're highly filling, they're highly satiety, high satiety. So the whole idea of willpower, I think that it's certainly in there because constantly testing ourselves in practice is what ends up leading to this loss of motivation and this feeling of fatigue and restriction.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but really quickly, do you have any preferred strategies to keep neat, non-exercise activity thermogenesis you talked about earlier up when you're tired after workouts?
Um, I actually think that these days it's never been easier to keep neat up, and I know that people are going to be really pissed at me for saying that, but you can disagree with me if you want to here. I think that strategies for keeping it up are building systems that make movement the default.
Hmm.
Exercise snacks are a great way to look at this. I think that the biggest issue that most people have when they try to increase their step count is they try to do it all at once, and that can feel very overwhelming. Oh, I don't have an entire hour at night to do this. Okay, you don't need to. Set an alarm to go off every hour at work. Walk around for 5 minutes.
Hmm.
That adds thousands of steps by the end of the day if you just walk around for 5 minutes every hour. Not only that, it's going to wake you up, it's going to oxygenate the brain, it's going to make you more productive at work.
Hmm.
Taking a 5 minute break is not going to destroy your productivity. It's probably going to really help it. Um, Park at a faraway parking spot, do
Hmm.
concurrent movements. When you're brushing your teeth, pace around in the morning. I hope you're brushing your teeth twice, do it at night. If you're talking on the phone at work, pace around while you're doing that. There's so many ways to get these step counts up. And if we're talking about specifically after a workout, if that's the time that you're able to get these types of things in, bring your phone, bring your iPad, step on the treadmill, listen to Audible, watch Netflix. I mean, that's what I mean when I say it's never been easier to do this. I mean, think about in the 90s when we were starting to get into these types of things, in the early 2000s, we had to bring like a Walkman with us. And we had tapes and that was it. Now you've got Spotify where you can listen to like literally any song you can think of. You can read books, you can watch TV shows and movies. I mean, do something that you're going to do at home anyways, because let's be honest, we all need that time to be able to stress relieve, right? So if you're going to be doing that, watch the show that you were going to watch anyways and get on a walking pad at home. Do it in front of your TV. Walking pads these days on Amazon are like 130 bucks. It's a very easy way to bring that up or make it really social. You know, get your family to go on a walk with you, take a dog out. Those different types of things can really be enriching for the family, can be really enriching for a pet. Play with your pet. I mean, even running around the house playing with your cat can be a great thing. Just get some
Hmm.
movement involved and it can start to make things productive in a more fun manner. But the biggest thing when we're looking at this type of thing is learning to treat movement as something that adds joy to your life, improves recovery, and is not punishment. Punishment is the big problem. When we're consistently looking at this, I mean, this is the exercise of the physical activity version of looking at starving yourself as punishment for overeating in one day. You don't use food or activity as punishment for anything. You use it to add something to your life. So think about ways that you can add to your life rather than taking away from it.
To your point, I bought a Kindle so that way I would bring books to the gym and I would sit on a bike and ride for a little while post workout. And so now I have a Kindle, so I have a bunch of books loaded up on that. And also, I recently got a hot tub, which has been magical. So I don't know if that does anything for calorie burn, probably, but that's not the point. But to your point about relaxing, boy, does that ever work wonders there. But I will actually read the Kindle in there. And honestly, and it's not about like having to optimize and make everything efficient, what have you. But I'll actually stay in there longer and I'll just relax. I'm not scrolling devices before bed, and it's been wonderful. everybody can, another thought if you got time.
I was about to say, yeah, I have not found cardio more easy at this point than using something like you've just talked about here. And I know that there are people that'll be doing high intensity interval training and maybe reading a book is not the right thing for you. But, for the majority of these instances, when we're talking about increasing need or doing moderate intensity cardio, I mean, I've gone through like 35 books this year alone with Audible.
Hmm.
And it's a wonderful way to unwind. And I do think that people need to give themselves the grace to stress relief. So find out a way that you can incorporate this with some of this activity level to be able to get that double shot.
Been great, my friend. Thank you again. Everybody can find you at Dr. Allan Bacon, Dr. Allan Bacon.
Yep.
Anything
On
else you want to share?
Instagram, you can find me there. If you want to check out my website that also has other links, you can go to mauiathletics.com. I have a full evidence-based blog there that you can get some benefit from as well.
And your podcast.
And my podcast, No Bull Just Bacon. You can look us up on Spotify, Apple, and on YouTube.
Depending on the time when this comes out, I've also been on yours recently. That was definitely an interesting conversation. So, guys, go check that out. Go follow Allan, please. Thanks for tuning in.